Well, thank you, Julie, and thank you to everybody who invited me here. I need to start by saying up front, I had no idea what to expect. And so this is an amazing crowd. I've got some formal remarks. I can cut those short anytime, and people can start asking questions or talking. Again, being the first one out of the gate, I wasn't quite sure where everyone was starting from. And believe it or not, the title, State of the Nation, is a little big. So what I'm going to try and do is sort of focus on some recent history, focus on some of the big issues right now, I think, that are facing us, and then take us back a little bit to sort of some grassroots orientations about democracy, right? So just some refresher, right? Now we start, where do you begin a conversation like this, especially these days, right? And there's this old story. Guy one day is trying to get to the train station, right? And so he goes up to another guy on the corner. He says, hey, how do I get to the train station? And the guy thinks for a minute and he goes, yeah, I don't know. If I was going to go to the train station, I wouldn't start from here. And I think for a lot of us, when we think about politics in America these days, I'm not quite sure this is where we would like to start from. But this is where we are. And so I want to focus a little bit about sort of how we got to this moment, right? Now, we start, hopefully, with a little bit of humor, right? Which I think captures at least a little bit of the mood of the country. This is from a comedian named Emo Phillips, and he tells the following story. This is the aging part, right? Right? He says, I was walking across a bridge one day and I saw a man standing on the edge, about to jump off. So I ran over to him. I said, stop, don't do it. Why shouldn't I, he said. I said, well, there's so much to live for. He said, like what? I said, well, are you religious or atheist? He said, religious. I said, me too. Are you Christian or Buddhist? He said, Christian. I said, me too. Are you Catholic or Protestant? He said, Protestant. I said, me too. I said, are you Episcopalian or Baptist? He said, Baptist. I said, me too. He said, Baptist Church of God? I said, me too. Are you Original Baptist Church of God or are you Reformed Baptist Church of God? He said, Reformed Baptist Church of God, 1879, or Reformed Baptist Church of God of Reformation, 1915. He said, Reformed Baptist Church of God, Reformation of 1915. I said, die heretic scum, and I pushed him off. What's amazing, right, is how much we can all have in common and how something that can seem so small can become so important and so divisive, right? The events of January 6th, 2021, right, were like a horror movie for people who follow politics and believe in this country. They were shocking, but sadly, not altogether surprising if you'd been paying attention. All of us now are characters in this drama that has been unfolding since that pivotal moment. Peggy Noonan, a former speechwriter for Ronald Reagan, wrote all the way back in 2005 in the Wall Street Journal, a long time ago, right? She says, I think there's an unspoken subtext in our national culture right now. In fact, I think it's a subtext to our society. I think a lot of people are carrying around in their heads, unarticulated and even in some cases unnoticed, a sense that the wheels are coming off the trolley and the trolley off the track, that in some deep fundamental way, things have broken down and can't be fixed or won't be fixed anytime soon. Now, if you're writing that in 2005, what does that look like in 2021, right? Because all I would say is, for me, it would be amped up significantly. Now, before I get into sort of the heart of the matter, I just wanted to do a little philosophy, right? And to sort of help us think through the way we construct arguments, right? Hannah Arendt, who's a political philosopher, wrote a book on truth in politics. And it wasn't a work of fiction, by the way. She said that you can interpret history in a lot of ways. And you can say a lot of different things about what's going on in the world. She goes, but one thing that you can never say that in 1939, Poland invaded Germany. some things at the end of the day are simply true. Right? Now, there aren't a lot of those things right now that most people could agree on as being simply true. But if we start to think about that sentence, we're talking here about analytic philosophy. We're talking here about analytic statements. So what do we mean? So take something like the world is round. That is a truth claim. Right? Say something like the world is flat. That is a truth claim. Right? At the end of the day, the way we figure out which of those is right is through experience and observation. Now, those are relatively simple, right? One way is, of course, you sail to the horizon, and if you don't fall off the edge of the world, then there's a good chance the Earth is round. The other way, of course, is you take off in a spaceship and you circle around the Earth and you look at it, and as long as you have the same definition of round as everybody else, you think that the Earth is round, right? These days, I'm not sure you could get people to agree on what round is, but assuming that we could, these truth propositions, right, are claims about the world like the claim that Germany invaded Poland, right? Pragmatism is another way of thinking about arguments, right? And pragmatism at its most basic is what works. And so here we would be talking about sentences like, if you want X, then do Y. If you don't want X, then don't do Y. Again, experience, reason, logic can help us figure out whether those are true or not true. If you don't want to get hit by the car, look both ways before you cross the street, right? Not a lot of disagreement there, right? When we think about this idea of logic and experience, right, one of the things that we want to keep in the back of our minds, right, is that if I was to take a ball and throw it up in the air 100 times, it would fall back to the Earth 100 times under normal conditions and normal circumstances. Right? Now, if I throw it up 100 times and 99 times it falls back to the Earth, but one time it stays in the air, that's what we call an anomaly. And we have to figure out how to explain why one stayed in the air. At the end of the day, our goal is to try and say something true about the world, at least as the starting point for a real conversation, right? Now, there are limits to logic, right? So anybody who took an ancient philosophy class probably knows the paradox of Zeno's arrow, right? The paradox of Zeno's arrow is, if I was to take a bow and arrow and I was to shoot it at that wall, right, it is impossible for that arrow to hit that wall. The reason it's impossible is because for the arrow to hit that wall, it first has to travel half the distance, and then it has to travel half that distance, and then it has to travel half that distance, and then it has to travel half that distance. In other words, logic tells us the arrow can never hit that wall because there is always another half no matter how small it is. Practical wisdom or experience tells us you should not stand in front of that wall when I fire an arrow at it, right? So again, not that logic isn't important and doesn't matter, but it can't get us everywhere that we would like to go. So as you start to think about your own experiences of the world, right? What you believe to be true, what you believe to be false, what you believed works, what you believe doesn't work. Try and interrogate those ideas, right? To find that common basis for having a real conversation with folks. It is impossible to have a good conversation about how to send a spaceship into outer space and have it return to Earth if you believe that the Earth is the center of the universe. If you believe the sun is the center of the universe, your odds go way up in terms of your ability to get back home. The final category, and these are the tough ones, are what we think of as normative statements, right? These are statements about what is just, what is unjust, what is beautiful, what is ugly, what is good, what is bad. These are the things that we argue about. These are the contested categories. These are the tough things, right? And there is a lot of diversity. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't truth, but it does mean that for most of us, the sets of beliefs that we have about those normative, value-laden statements, right, are things that we have grown up and learned. They are socially constructed to some extent by history, by culture, by education. The sources for those normative beliefs and values might be religion, might be authority, might be reason, might be history. But part of the hope for a society that wants to, on some level, get along is that eventually we come to some kind of inner subjective agreement about how to answer those questions. And if we can't come to that agreement about how to answer those questions, especially about really important things, then we have the culture wars. Then we have the clash of civilizations. Then we have disputation that often turns ugly. And this is not to say that I have the answer to those questions, but what I'm trying to say for you tonight is I'm going to try and stay clear of those for right now and try and sort of stay in the lane of what I believe are analytic, right, and pragmatic kinds of statements about the world. And you may disagree with those as well, that's okay, but at least think about whether or not it says something you hear as being true. Now, here's the controversial part, but I think these are true statements. Recent history, right? The election of 2016 was unprecedented. Unprecedented. Now, for some people, it was unprecedented in a really good way. And for some people, it was unprecedented in a really bad way. But there aren't a lot of people who are neutral about what happened in 2016 that I have met. Donald Trump is an inflection point in American political history, right? An inflection point, so I'm getting old, right? I feel a little younger in this room, but I'm getting old. Right? I need a new hip, okay? Which I never thought I would say, right? And I was perfectly fine until 2 years ago, January, walking the golf course, right, 3 times a week during COVID, 7 miles a day, felt great, right? Big guy, but in good shape for my size. And then one day I walked it, and it was the last day I walked it for the last 2 years. What was going wrong in my body clicked, right? It just changed. And on some level, right, 2016 feels a little bit like that because it was such a different moment in time. Now look, this is not a critique of Donald Trump. This is simply a set of what I believe are factual statements, right? Donald Trump's ascent was unlikely. He had no political experience or significant public service. So he wasn't an Eisenhower, and he wasn't a Reagan, right? A lack of knowledge and understanding of American history, the political system, or the norms of either running for office or serving as president. Right? Simply put, there are things he did that no one had ever done. Right? Third, a lack of a consistent political ideology, or even substantive political policies and programs. Right? MAGA is not a public policy. It is an emotionally charged appeal, and it has a lot of rhetorical value coming from a speaker. But again, trying to figure out what it meant, good luck, because it meant sometimes things that were very different from themselves. Right? In this world where we talk about making America great again, the when is never defined. Right? Now, it's not that there aren't points in time that all of us probably would say were better or worse, sometimes where we rose to the level of greatness, perhaps, but you couldn't get a good answer about exactly when we were looking to return to. There was a seeming lack of personal piety or devotion to customary American values or any particular spiritual or philosophical tradition. Right? And yet, widespread popularity and even devotion from millions and millions of Americans. For some, it was a level of devotion based on what they believed the policies were going to look like, the kinds of judges that you might get, the kinds of tax policy that you might get, the kinds of military intervention or non-intervention that you might get. For some, it was simply a distaste for his opponent and the policies that they thought that that would bring. This is fairly traditional. But there's also another group. And this other group was devoted, and it transcended rational calculation of his weaknesses. Most of the time, those weaknesses that traditional political scientists would talk about became strengths. He wasn't from Washington. He wasn't part of the system. He was going to drain the swamp. He was going to own the libs. And at this, he was very, very good, in the sense that he drew millions and millions of people to his cause. Whatever else is true, nothing in US politics, from my perspective, has been the same since he was elected, with 61.2 million popular votes and 306 electoral votes. Clinton received 62.5 million votes, but only 232 electoral votes. And in our system, that means Donald Trump was the President of the United States. Now, despite that, Donald Trump, when he assumed power, of course, faced a whole lot of pushback, which he reminds us of all the time. In 2020, one of the questions that emerged is whether or not Poland actually did invade Germany. And what I mean by this is, Joe Biden received 81.2 million popular votes and 306 electoral votes, and Donald Trump received 74.2 million popular votes and 232 electoral votes. Now, when Donald Trump says that his numbers were more than anybody who had ever been elected president of the United States, he's right. No one had ever received as many votes as he received in the 2020 election, except, of course, for Joe Biden, who received more. He made 12 million new votes from the time he was elected in 2016 to 2020. So I can understand when you pick up that kind of ground that it is disappointing. Despite those widely but still not universally accepted results, Trump and many of his supporters repeatedly allege, and often continue to allege, that the election was stolen as a result of fraud on the part of the Democrats and their operatives. Now, all of you know these things, but after 60 lawsuits and numerous appeals, no significant evidence of fraud has been validated in any court of law, and no irregularities that would have made significant impact on the outcome of the race have been demonstrated to the satisfaction of a significant majority of American people. That's a fact. Now, this is an interesting kind of way to look at the world, right? When you think about the argument that's being made, and this will offend somebody, so I apologize. For a long time, I've watched politics, most of my life, right? And I'm going to tell you that the Democratic Party that I grew up knowing about, watching, listening to, if they could have pulled that kind of conspiracy off, right, I would have given everybody in this country $1. That having been said, it is still out there, right? And it is still contested. Despite those legal losses, the preponderance of public opinion, the soon-to-be former president and his supporters continue to argue that it had been stolen, and began a strategy to overturn the results prior to the official confirmation of Joe Biden in a joint session of Congress. We know the history that follows. We know what happened on January 6th. We know that people died. We know that the Capitol was besmirched and violated. We know that this country faced an existential crisis. It could have turned out very differently if it wasn't for a few key actors and a few important decisions. I won't go through the list of people who will be called heroes someday, right? But there were a number of folks who simply by doing their jobs made sure that we didn't end up with something much more problematic on our hands. Now, in the aftermath of all of this, right, recent history, Americans have been polled. and have given opinions that I think most of us will find a little bit disturbing. Here's the context for the state of the nation. 85%, and these are all very recent polls, 85% of Americans believe the country is going in the wrong direction. 85%. This isn't a Republican thing, this isn't a Democrat thing, this is an American thing. The vast majority of the country thinks that we're going in the wrong direction. I don't know anybody in that other 15% personally, so I'm unclear whether that is actually the right number at 85%. 69% of Democrats and Republicans believe that American democracy is in danger of collapsing. 69%. Again, Democrats and Republicans. 66% of Americans believe that politicians are only interested in their own self-interest. This is a crisis for an institution. 47% of Republicans who ran for office in 2022 refused to accept the results of the election and denied that they could have possibly lost. Here's the one that is the scariest number of all to me. A recent CBS poll, this is in 2022, found that when asked whether they saw the members of the other party as enemies or political opponents, 47% of Democrats and 49% of Republicans said enemies. This is not sustainable. One of the things that a country like ours rests upon is that we look at our political opponents as members of the loyal opposition. People whom we disagree with, people whom we may think aren't very bright, people who we might think aren't very good, people who we may have all sorts of opinions about, but at the end of the day, we still think that they are citizens committed on some level to the good of the country in their own way. The loyal opposition, not enemies. If you see others as enemies, then you ultimately come to reject the peaceful transfer of power. Who is going to give power over to their enemies? It makes no sense. Eventually, then, this, of course, leads to a rejection of the peaceful transfer of power, and ultimately a rejection of the rule of law itself. All of those are pillars upon which a free, democratic nation depends in order to survive over time. One shining, brief piece of good news is that about 85% of Americans still believe that using violence in order to secure your political will is wrong. The problem is that the 15% who said that it is probably necessary has grown in the last few years. That number used to be small single digits. It is now double digits. There's a movie, I don't know who else sees a lot of movies, but a movie Cormac McCarthy wrote a number of years ago called No Country for Old Men. And in that movie, the sheriff and his deputy come across a scene in which two rival gangs had shot it out with each other over drug money. And there were bodies everywhere, and they even killed the dogs, right? And the deputy says to the sheriff, Tommy Lee Jones is the sheriff, he says to the sheriff, "Boy, this sure is a mess." And Tommy Lee Jones says, "Well, if it's not the mess, it'll certainly do till the real one comes along." All right? Now, if you can hear those numbers and not see a mess, you're going to have to help me at the question and answer part, because those numbers scare me. The 2022 elections that we just experienced, the midterm elections, right, showed us that we are still a 50-50 country. Right? We now have a Senate with 51 Democrats and 49 Republicans. We have a House with 222 Republicans and 213 Democrats. I haven't seen if Santos has stepped down yet or not, so that number might have changed, but you get it. Now, one of the problems for the Republicans in a year that they should have won fairly big by all historical measures is that there were some really bad candidates. And again, this is not me judging them from a moral perspective. These were objectively bad candidates. Herschel Walker, Mehmet Oz, right? My Democratic friends would probably yell and scream when they hear me say this, but I believe that almost any mainstream Republican would have won the Georgia Senate race and won it fairly handily. Right? Bad candidates. You had people on the abortion question, right, who were so far outside of the mainstream of what Americans think as to suggest that there was absolutely no instance in which it might be permissible, even under moral law that has been established for years and years and years, not just Supreme Court law, but the life of the mother being endangered, right? No exceptions. These folks, for the most part, did poorly. Right? You had a whole number of election deniers who ran for office. Again, this hurt them. You had people who were literally breaking bread with white supremacists. Literally. This is not a good electoral strategy in this country. Finally, you had a massive turnout, right, for a midterm election. And this is never usually going to be good for Republicans. And the reason it's not going to be good for Republicans is because there are more Democrats in the United States and more independents than there are Republicans. Democrats have won the popular vote in 7 out of the last 8 presidential elections. Right? People can read the handwriting on the wall. Now, they haven't lost the presidency all of those times, but that is an important number. Right? So in this 50-50 country, right, what were the voters the most concerned about? What did they tell us during the exit polls that led to this outcome? The biggest concern, big surprise, the economy. Right? 79% said that was the most important issue. And these are all registered voters that were polling here. Number 2, the future of American democracy. 70% of Americans said that this was one of the things that was the most important issue for them when they went into the ballot box to vote. And if you're wondering about the numbers, that was 70% of those were Democrats, but 80% of those were Republicans. So again, not one-sided. People are worried. This second question here, right, coming in ahead of all sorts of other things like immigration, like abortion, like education, like war and peace, was a first for me. I've never seen anybody poll and come back with numbers that said 70% of the American people said that the second most important issue in the ballot box for them was the future of American democracy. Who even knew that was a question? Yeah.
I have a question. I live in Centerville. Most of these people vote for.
Yeah,
This is a very conservative community.
sure,
Most of these people probably have voted conservative.
absolutely,
Montgomery County voted in 2016 for President Donald Trump.
absolutely,
For the first time in 30 years, Montgomery County was a red community.
absolutely.
So I would appreciate it if we could start the conversation and quit having you dog Republicans, the president.
So what I'd like to say is none of those, I think,
Do this for a while, and it's getting
these aren't dogging, right? These are the poll numbers, Republicans and Democrats.
There was a whole group of people that went to Washington, D.C. because they felt they were cheated out of an election.
I know that.
Okay, so you said it was all, there were people that were killed. That is not the truth. That is not the case.
There were people who died, I should have said.
They were not.
Yes, should have died. I should have said died, you're correct.
Okay,
Yes.
so don't, please, feed us information and do this to this whole community of people and have us sitting here with, we'd like to communicate with each other, not hear your stuff. I'm sorry.
That's okay. So we can stop anytime if you want. Yeah, sure. Okay. So, yeah.
Keep doing what you're doing.
Okay. In any case, right, all I'm trying to relay are what I think are the important numbers about what Americans think, right? And admit, right, that there is something going on. Democracy in America, if that's the second most important thing that people said coming out of the polling place was on their mind, matters. And so one of the things that I wanted to spend a little time talking about with you and have you talk with me about is what democracy is. There's a speech that was given by David Foster Wallace a number of years ago at Kenyon College. And he starts the speech by basically saying, these two fish are swimming along one day, and the one fish says to the other fish, the water is really clear today. And the other fish looks back and says, what's water? Now, the point of this for Foster Wallace and for me tonight is there are lots of things that we take for granted that we haven't thought a lot about in a long time. One of the questions for us tonight is, can democracy survive in the world that we have been describing? The greatest threat to democracy, right, these days is a feature of democracy itself. Open culture of communication. Right? This is unwieldy, right? And we all know what this looks like. Right? This creates a lot of noise and a lot of emotion. The second piece that we always need to remember is that democracy is a contest. There is no inevitable outcome. Nothing forbids a democracy from voting for authoritarianism, from voting itself out of existence. This has been done before, right? There are disturbing trends worldwide that we are a part of. In the 1990s, we saw 72 countries that were considered to be democratizing, and 3 becoming more authoritarian as measured by the Pew Foundation. Last year, only 15 countries were becoming more democratic, and 33 were sliding towards authoritarianism. And my question for us is, good riddance, or is this a problem? Has democracy's day come and gone? Has our ability to govern ourselves come and gone? If it has, then we would only be realigning ourselves with most of human history. Democracy, for most of its history, has been a dirty word until very recently. Most of us grew up with the word, but we don't understand that it's only about 100 years that people have actually said democracy and thought that they were saying something good about the way the government should work. For the most part, human history has rejected democracy as mob rule, has rejected it because of a fear of tyranny of the majority, has rejected it because we were worried that democracy would take away property rights and other rights. So when we go to talk about democracy, the question is, what are the first principles? Right? What is democracy? Rule by the people. Simple enough, right? From the Greek. Who are the people, constitutionally speaking? This has been a long and, in some cases, tortured history for us to figure out the answer to that question. When we talk about who the people are, we're talking about who the citizens are, and we're talking about citizens, we're talking about who should have the power to make decisions and vote. We know that early on, right, it was basically property-owning white men from Europe who were full citizens. With Andrew Jackson's ascent, property rights became more widespread and more people were brought into the fold and property became less important, but it was still then only white men. The 14th Amendment to the Constitution after the Civil War tells us that citizens are going to be anybody born or naturalized in this country. Right? And ever since then, we've been working out what the people should look like. A whole list of amendments really fast. The 15th that gives African American men the right to vote. Right? We see the 17th Amendment, which has direct election for senators. We see the 19th, which brings us women's suffrage. The 23rd, which gives D.C. power to vote in elections. We see the 24th, which eliminates the poll tax. The 26th, which gives 18-year-olds the right to vote. We see the 64 and 65 Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts and a whole series of Supreme Court decisions basically expanding dramatically who the people were. Right? That's been the march. Right? Has that been a good thing for us? Has that been positive? Is that what ought to happen? Why do we have democracy? Why, of all the things that we could have picked, that most, for 10,000 years, human beings had said no to democracy, why did we pick it? Why did we make that choice? Again, we can argue about this, but I think it's a fairly straightforward proposition. It is the notion of moral equality. When we talk about the master idea of the American Revolution, that phrase from Jefferson, all men are created equal, is a powerful and historically brand new idea about who should be allowed to participate. Lincoln once said, when he was writing about the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, that the Constitution was the frame and the Declaration of Independence was the picture. That was the most important and central idea. Right? Now, the equality that Jefferson put forward was not equality of condition, was not mathematical equality. It was the idea that all human beings were created equal by the same Heavenly Father. Right? Moral equality pushes us to reject natural hierarchies. Now, this claim wasn't new in 1776, certainly not theologically new by any stretch of the imagination. Read Paul. But by putting this idea forward as our national starting point, we brought into existence an order that the world had never seen before. Now, how is democracy supposed to work? Remember, fish and water, right? So if you all know this, sorry, right? But the thing we start with are three questions. Who votes? How much does each vote count? And how many votes does it take to reach a decision? That's the core. Right? The big part for a lot of us is what we might think of as the sort of when and what of democracy. Right? What is it that we actually decide using that process? Because that process leaves a pretty wide open playing field. We could vote for all sorts of things. And so for a lot of us, one of the other cores to the American experience are those limits, the things that we say you're not allowed to vote on or for, what someone gets to believe, how someone gets to worship, what someone gets to say, what someone gets to write. We take a whole series of things and we say we don't get to vote on those things. But those things are always contested and always being argued about, and the boundaries are always shifting. Right? Should we have democracy? Winston Churchill famously said what? That democracy was the worst system of government ever created except for all the others. Right? Was he right? Right? So if we go back to those analytic statements, right? Are all human beings created equal? If we answer yes to that, then what does that mean politically speaking? If we answer no to that, then what do we believe instead? And what would that mean politically speaking? C.S. Lewis once said that he was a Democrat, small d. A Democrat because he believed in the fall of man. Not because there weren't some who deserved to be slaves, but because there were none who deserved to be masters. Now, this is, on some level, not high praise for democracy, but it is praise of a sort. And if we're not going to accept the notion of moral equality as the foundation for democracy, then we have to push ourselves to answer what should be the basis for who gets to be one of the people. Here's a list of things that people have used historically: intelligence, race, gender, sexual orientation, ethnicity, religion, being able-bodied, wealth, strength, being English-speaking. Those are just some of the options that we would have to gravitate towards if we said we aren't all created equal. Who is better? Who is worse? The question for me tonight for all of you is, can this democracy survive? It's an empirical question. At the end of the day, we'll find out. History will tell us whether or not it can survive. Where's the good money? I hate to tell you this, but the history of politics is the history of failure. That every community that has been put together in the history of human civilization has failed, has died out. The high water mark might be the Roman Republic at 700 years. The low water mark might be the Third Reich at 7 years. We're at 234. Right? A long way to go till 700. Right? Can we make it? And if we don't, what does a post-democratic America look like? Right? Finally, and then I'll shut up. Right? When we think about the human condition, right, two things should scare all of us: newness and unpredictability. The thing about being human is that we are quite literally capable of doing anything at any time. That's a terrifying proposition. On the other side, though, it's also exhilarating and exciting. We can choose again and again to do things differently, to do things better. We have massive amounts of freedom to decide how we're going to live with each other. Now, the way that we avoid the terrifying parts of this, right, of the unpredictability of human beings, is through two things. The first is promises. We promise to one another certain things and we deliver on those promises, and that gives us faith that the world is stable, predictable, knowable. And the other is forgiveness. That when we do things that do damage or harm the world, that we can ask for forgiveness and be forgiven so that we don't have to live with all of the things that we've unleashed on the world that we feel guilty for, terrible about. In this world, how do we figure out how to make promises to one another again, how to keep promises to one another again, and how to ask one another for forgiveness? And again, since I don't know the rules, if you want people to talk at their tables about some of those big questions, that's up to you. If you want them to talk through me or to me.
On the political philosophies of Saul Alinsky and George Soros, especially in filtering our society and driving us not together but totally apart.
Yeah, so I think people are more familiar with George Soros probably than Saul Alinsky. So Alinsky wrote a book called Rules for Radicals back in the 1960s, right, that he dedicated actually to Satan. Right? Now, he dedicated it to Satan not because he was Satanist, but he dedicated it to Satan because Satan was the first rebel, and Saul Alinsky wanted to be a rebel. I don't know that he is much in vogue, right, anymore, in the sense that there aren't a lot of folks who still talk about what Saul Alinsky was trying to do with the New Left and with the student movement. But certainly the idea of a kind of democracy is in the streets, right, approach has outlived Saul Alinsky. Right? George Soros is a little harder for me to understand, right, and I don't know that I can speak to him other than he's certainly a massive supporter of what we would think of as liberal causes and a large funder, right, of those causes. I don't know enough about George Soros to know what his motivations are, though. Well, I think that there are certainly people who believe that, and George Soros, he wants to build something as well as destroy, but yes, there's a piece of that, right? So I've heard that, but I just don't know enough to be knowledgeable, right?
Well, the reason I was saying Saul Alinsky because Hillary Clinton wrote her master's thesis on him.
Sure.
And reflects his philosophy as pitting us against one group against the other, and the other group has to be destroyed in order for you to win.
Yeah. So Hillary Clinton, I think, was a very different person 40 or 50 years after she wrote that. But she certainly was that person as a young woman. Yeah.
There's
Sure.
there's two more. And if anybody from the audience asks a question, do you mind just repeating it so
Sure.
everybody can hear?
Yeah. Tenure for professors. Yes. One of the things about tenure for professors is it provides us with the opportunity for academic freedom. And it allows us to say controversial things and allows other people to say controversial things in response to those. There are things that I've written in my books that make some of my colleagues very uncomfortable. Right? I write quite a bit about the relationship between my Christian faith and democracy and politics. That is not always a hugely popular subject in a lot of the halls of academia today. And so I'm happy that I have the opportunity to say those things, to talk about love, right? To talk about the real presence, to talk about what communion looks like, and to talk about what a Christian-grounded politics looks like. On the same token, though, right, my Marxist friends, though there aren't that many of them anymore, right, certainly need protection if we want those ideas to be talked about. If we don't, again, we can rethink the Bill of Rights. We can rethink whether or not we want a fair, free exchange of ideas, and even controversial ones, and we can decide which ideas pass muster and which ones don't. That's being done all over the world right now. What's your opinion of the Electoral College? Yeah, so this is one that I struggle with, right? My first book was on the Anti-Federalist, right? So these were people who opposed the ratification of the Constitution and were strong proponents of states' rights. And when I wrote that book, I would have put myself in that position. Even though there were some states that I wasn't real thrilled about what they were doing, I believed that people had a right to govern themselves, and that governing themselves at the most local possible level was the most defensible way of thinking about how we could figure out how to live with one another. To that extent, the Electoral College makes a lot of sense. If we're going to have states, and they're going to be independently governed, and they're going to have their own systems of representation and their own laws and their own mores and their own rules, then simply having them outvoted by states that happen to be massively more populated can be problematic. Right? I think that though there's a hard case to make for this as a democratic idea, it was, for the founders, explicitly an anti-democratic idea. It was a very liberal idea in the classic sense of that term, but it was not a democratic idea. Right? So today, I would probably keep it. Right? But admittedly, it's becoming a harder sell. Right? It allows, in some cases, some people to have vastly more representation than others. So if you look at states that are sparsely populated like Idaho or Wyoming or Montana, who all have 2 senators in the United States Senate representing not even in some cases 1 million people, and then you have 2 senators from California or Florida or Texas representing tens of millions of people. There's a case to be made that there is a lopsided division of power because of it. So again, I don't like to punt, and I don't usually punt. I would probably keep it, but I'm less sure of it than I was 30 years ago when I wrote about it the first time. Yeah.
My question to everybody would be, do we want California controlling everything we do in the United States and being more like California? I don't want that. And that's why I think part of the reasoning behind Electoral College
It is, for sure.
keeps us all from being California.
Well, or keeping us all from being Texas, or keeps us all from being Florida, any of the populous states, right? What do you think of the Convention of States organization? I'm not sure what the question means. Convention of States.
That was my
Okay,
question.
sure. Give me a little bit of,
Okay, the Convention of States organization is trying to get states to vote for a convention.
for a constitutional convention.
Article 5.
Yes. So again, as someone who wrote about the Anti-Federalists a long time ago, the last time we had a constitutional convention, it didn't work out the way the people who voted to do it thought that it was going to, right? And to the extent that I'm not convinced that we have the capacity to have that kind of conversation in a healthy way right now, I'd be very nervous about what it might produce. There's a part of me that loves the idea, but, you know, I go to,
19 states
Right.
that have voted.
yeah, again, I would probably, if it was up to me, which again, it's not, would not vote for it these days. Again, I'm a little bit nervous about what, not so much would come out of it, but about what that would do to the divisiveness in the country that we already have and how it would amplify that, right? Maybe not a good reason not to do it. Maybe sometimes things have to happen, but I wouldn't vote for it.
Chris, there's a question over here.
Sure,
Jim?
yeah.
This is not so much a question, maybe a couple of items I'd like you just to expand on.
Sure.
I read somewhere a long time ago, and you would know whether the statistic is correct or correct, but any government that called itself a democracy, good or bad, the average lifespan is about 300 years. I don't know if that's right. but you maybe-
Yeah, I have no idea. That sounds long to me, right? That sounds very long to me. So when but there aren't that many examples,
Well, that's right.
right? So again, I can't say yes or no because it would depend on who. So if we include Athens in that mix, right, as a democracy of a certain kind, right, it would depend on who gets into the club, right?
Well, anyway, to the second point, you just alluded to a little bit your Christian background here that influences certain things that you say. A divided house cannot stand. Don't we know the answer to this? And just to comment a little bit about ideology versus truth,
Sure.
please.
So, a house divided against itself cannot stand, right? Is a famous line from a speech given by Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War, right? And Lincoln, of course, draws that out of the gospel, right? And in the political context, it's basically just a tautological statement, right? When you say a house divided against itself cannot stand, by definition, that's just true, right? The Civil War, just to I think make sure everybody has the same numbers, right? Represented a significant failure for the constitutional theories of James Madison, right? In the sense that a system that was put together to avoid creating two large factions that would go to war with each other ultimately yielded that in 70 years and almost destroyed us. The math, just to be clear, because there's lots of folks out there glibly sometimes talking about civil war. 600,000 Americans died in the Civil War. In the 1850 census, there were 18 million Americans. So the equivalent number by today's population of about 335 million would be about 35 to 40 million deaths. And keep in mind, back in 1861, 1862, it was a lot harder to kill people than it is now. So a lot of those people, of course, you had to stab, you had to hit with rocks, you had to murder with your bare hands. So the 35 or 40 million might be a low number if we decided to go to war with each other today. That's every man, woman, and child in Michigan, in Ohio, in Tennessee, in Kentucky, in West Virginia, in Arkansas, in Mississippi, one more I can't think of, combined. So that would be my first answer to the House divided question, as strange as that sounds. We're not in a good place, right? And how it ends, I don't know at this point. The other part of the question was political ideology, right? And versus truth. Again, I don't think that anything that I said earlier, right, even though it stirred strong responses, right, isn't true. Right? Donald Trump was an unconventional candidate, right? The American public's, right, but I'm saying that those polling numbers, right, those aren't made up numbers, those are Democrats and Republicans who think that we're in trouble. So one of the problems, of course, with political ideology is if it becomes, right, excuse the language here, but if it becomes, what's the right word, an idol, right? If we invest it with the power of something beyond a set of beliefs that can be questioned, challenged, and revised, and turn it into a gospel message of its own, and try and make the world conform to it, that is usually a recipe for failure. Right? And so to that extent, right, and again, where you draw your truth from matters. Now, again, I'll just say this because I say this in print, right? I draw my inspiration from Jesus Christ. I draw my inspiration from the gospel, from the call to love each and every person as a child of God, the Imago Dei, and to try and figure out from what I think of as a truth that we are all created by one loving Father and are all therefore brothers and sisters. As my starting point, I do not believe that that is ideological, though some people do, but if from that truth I can derive certain ways to think about the world, about what we should do and what we shouldn't do to each other, how we should live with one another and how we shouldn't. Right. Sure. Yeah. Yes.
I heard you say democracy is a contest. I think that's what I heard.
Yes, absolutely.
Would you explain that some more, please?
Sure.
And the second part of this, if not democracy, then what?
Sure. So when we say it's a contest, right, all we mean is that the outcome is always in doubt. Right? Now, let me give you one more religious allusion, if I could, and then come back to your question. Right? So one of the things that sometimes I'll talk to my students about is that the idea that Hollywood fundamentally misunderstands Christianity. Right? And I don't mean for the reasons that most people would say. Right? It misunderstands Christianity because when you see movies about, let's say, the end of the world, we have a situation, right, where we have Satan over here, right, and a Christ-like figure over here, and they're doing battle with one another, right, and the outcome of that battle is going to determine the fate of the world. Well, that misses the whole point of what happened at Calvary. Christ already won that fight. It's not in doubt for me. If you were to say, let's go back to, a couple of nights ago, right? When Georgia put a significant hurt on Texas Christian University. If I was to ask you tonight, do you want to bet on Georgia or do you want to bet on TCU? Who would you bet on? Georgia. This means that you are all smart people, right? Our job as Christians, if you are of that ilk, right, is not to see who wins the fight, it's to pick the right team. The right team has already won the battle. What does that have to do with your question? Right? So this notion, right, of democracy as a contest is that we don't know what the outcome's going to be. That we go into that ballot box, right? We go into that polling place and we cast our vote along with 150 million of our fellow citizens, and then we count and we see who wins. And who wins matters, right? Who wins matters. But it's always in doubt. There is not a single person in the world that I follow who thought Donald Trump could win. But he won. Right? He won. That was a surprise to a lot of people. I think that there were people in Donald Trump's own camp that were surprised that they won. None of the numbers we had beforehand suggested that that was going to happen, but it did. It's a contest. Right? And so again, there are all sorts of things that we can put through that process, right? Who votes? How much is each vote worth? How many votes does it take to make a decision that suggests that the world could be a very, very different place, for better and for worse. So that's what I mean by it's a contest, right? The outcome's in doubt. The second piece, if not democracy, what? Well, Aristotle basically said that there are three logical possibilities: rule by the one, rule by the few, or rule by the many. Right? Now that again is a logical statement. Right? There is no category other than the one, the few, or the many. And that translates then roughly into rule by the many, some kind of democracy. Right? Rule by the few, some sort of aristocracy or oligarchy. Or rule by the one, some sort of monarchy. Now those are the three basic choices that we have. Now there are all kinds of variations, right, on those choices. All sorts of different ways of thinking about who is in the aristocratic class, thinking about who the monarch ought to be, thinking about who the people are. But those are the three categories, and we would have to choose one of those, the one, the few, or the many, and then we would have to define what we mean by those terms. Does that make sense? Sure. Yeah.
Is that what they thought by a constitutional republic?
So for Aristotle, the word that he would have used would have been polity, and for us it would translate roughly as a constitutional republic. Now, a lot of people sometimes misunderstand the word republic. In traditional political theory, you're either a principality, which is ruled by a prince or a king, or you're a republic, a free state, not ruled by a prince or a king. Within the category of republics, there are all kinds of different republics. Some of them are participatory democracies, right? And so you have the people all getting together and making decisions and choices for themselves. That's the sort of most extreme form, right, of a democratic republic. At the other hand, right, you have things that would look more familiar to us, like representative democracy, Senate, House of Representatives, people elected who basically make those choices and decisions. Right? And then there are, of course, lots of variations in between. But for most people, when we talk about republics, it simply designates a free state, a state without a prince or a monarch, and the others are principalities or monarchies. So the key person here, if you're ever bored, right, is Machiavelli. Machiavelli writes one book called The Prince, which is about how princes ought to govern, and the other is a discourse on Titus Livy, in which he talks about republics and how those were run in Rome. Does that answer your question? Okay, yeah. In the back, yeah, please.
I just wanted to say that.
Is there someone?
I'm sorry, just one thing. The official name of North Korea is the Democratic People's Republic.
Absolutely. And actually, there is no more democratic sounding constitution that I've read than that of the former Soviet Union, which tells you, of course, it's not all just in the words. Yeah. Was someone over here? I'm going to, yeah, please, sir.
Question on the California issue.
Sure.
If you have a democracy, what's wrong with that?
If you have a democracy,
Government of the people, for the people, by the people.
so there's nothing inherently wrong with that, right? It means, of course, that you may have very different kinds of outcomes, but there's nothing inherently wrong with it. Again, that's a choice.
I mean, in allowing them to vote.
And allowing, you mean the majority to rule without the Electoral College? Is that the root of the question? There's nothing wrong with that in any kind of existential sense, right? There's no place where I can go and find something wrong with that. It certainly would be counter to what the framers of the Constitution intended. And so it would be very different than what we began with, but that doesn't mean that it's not right. It means, though, that it would be different in ways that we would have to think seriously about whether you could still preserve certain rights and certain liberties that people hold right now in a world in which majority rule could decide all questions and issues.
But didn't we do that with the Dakotas?
With the what?
The Dakotas?
I'm not sure the reference, so.
Didn't we split North and South Dakota so they got 2 more senators?
I just don't, I don't know the history of the Dakotas well enough to answer that question, so I'll just take your word for it. Yes.
Well, that's what they did.
Yeah, I said,
South Dakota, so
Yeah.
they would get 2 more senators.
Sure.
Why isn't,
I'm not sure that was the only reason, but it certainly has worked out that way.
I'm not sure that I don't agree that we ought not split California from the country, but at the same time, it seems that in the basis of democracy, somehow we are denying their rights.
There,
People in California, New York.
so there is no doubt, right, that the United States is a very counter-majoritarian republic and democracy of a kind. And the features that make us counter-majoritarian, simply meaning, right, that the majority does not rule, the Senate is a counter-majoritarian institution, right, by design, right? Originally, of course, we weren't even allowed to vote for senators. They were picked by state legislators, right? The filibuster is a counter-majoritarian tool. Judicial review is a counter-majoritarian rule. Right? Again, there are reasons for limiting what majorities can and cannot do, right? And some of them are good and some of them are self-serving.
Accepting that,
Yeah.
that the Senate is that way, what about the House? In other words, couldn't the House be more divided in terms of population? Every representative representing an equal number of people?
So every representative in the House does represent close to an equal number of people, right? So about 750,000 or so, right? It's not precise, but it is pretty representative, which is why we move, right, those votes around after census, right? So some states gain, some states lose electors because they lose members of the House of Representatives because their population has shifted to other states. But the actual size of representatives' constituencies are relatively equal.
Based on the census,
Based on the census, yes.
assuming the census.
Yep, assuming the census is more or less correct. I think, again, we could probably not say that it's precise, but we could say that it's accurate if what we mean by that is there are more people moving to places like Arizona and Colorado and Nevada than there are moving to places like Ohio and Michigan and Vermont. Right? So to the extent that those states, right, Texas, Florida, right, have grown in size, it seems to me accurate, even if I don't know that we could say it's precise. Right? Sure. Yeah, in the back.
It's my understanding framers wrote the Constitution to form the United States as a constitutional republic, rather than as a strict democracy in order to protect the United States of America, because they believe a strict democracy would vote itself into bankruptcy, like that.
For sure.
We would completely fail. Democracy, absolute democracy is destined for failure, and the framers chose a constitutional republic to protect it from that. I'd like to comment on that.
Yeah, sure. So again, just keeping in mind that all republic means is that we weren't going to have aristocrats, right? So a free state, right? A constitutional republic doesn't say anything in particular about what kind of republic you have, other than it's one that has a constitution, which most of them now do, right? England does not, right? But most of them now do. The kind of constitution that they wrote, right, is the real question I think that you're asking. And the kind of constitution that they wrote was absolutely at its core, if I had to say what the biggest fear was of the framers of the Constitution, it was fear of majority tyranny. Right? Fear of majority tyranny. Now, that having been said, right, once you start to try and limit majority tyranny, you then have to engage in certain kinds of counter-majoritarian institutions and rules. So the Electoral College, for example, right, as one that's come up before, was designed in large measure to make sure that the majority did not elect a Napoleon, right? Did not elect an authoritarian dictator, right? And was meant at its inception, at least, to be a much more active body in terms of more freedom to choose who to cast those ballots for and less linked to the democratic will of the people in their particular states. This would be controversial, but I've argued it before. I actually, as much as you can say a sentence like this with a straight face, I actually believe that the framers thought that most presidential elections after Washington's were going to be decided in the House of Representatives. And the reason that I would argue that is Washington was a national figure, widely known by everybody and assumed by almost everybody to be the first president. Part of the way that you got this thing that had never existed before into a constitution called the presidency, no one had ever heard of that, right? We invented it. Part of the reason we got that was because they all thought it was going to be Washington, and a large number of us trusted him. After that, though, what the framers imagined, I would say, is that you would have a number of favorite sons, people who were popular in particular states or particular regions of the country, who would have a very difficult time given the lack of national communication, media, with being known outside of a small region, which for me implied at least that there was a good chance you would have 4 or 5 people to choose from, none of them with a majority of electoral votes. The other thing that would make me say this is the original Constitution, of course, has no provision for political parties, which is why you end up with, right, Jefferson and Adams serving together. The original Constitution gave the presidency to the person with the most votes, the vice presidency to the person with the second most votes. So if that was true today, Donald Trump would be vice president and Joe Biden would be president. 4 years ago, Hillary Clinton would have been vice president and Donald Trump would have been president. They decided pretty early on that this was not going to be a workable scheme. Once they created political parties, right? Once they created political parties, that set the stage then for more national candidates to emerge because you would have 2 parties rather than multiple states putting forward candidates. So that was a really down in the weeds answer to your question. I hope it made sense. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Real quick, you said you wouldn't have people on opposing parties. Lincoln chose the opposing party to be the vice president.
He did.
Because he desired, prayed, the unity to be restored.
Absolutely.
So I don't think it's as silly as you think.
Well, I'm not saying it's silly. I'm saying that it means that the chances of the House of Representatives being asked to decide the next president have gone way down because of it. That's all. Right. Yeah. Please.
Could you talk about a little bit about Christian religion and politics?
Yeah.
Past, present.
Read your book.
You may need to invite me back. But what I would say, this is a shameless plug, right? So my most recent book came out last year. It's called Radical Conversion, Theorizing Catholic Citizenship in the American Liberal State. And I trace that argument from the very early origins of the church to the contemporary time. So that's the shameless plug. I'm going to skip to the end of that book rather than do the long history of politics and religion, which we don't have enough time for. Right? But for me, right, so the argument that I make in that book is that the most important and fundamental idea that we get from the Gospels is the sacredness of the human person. My favorite scripture passage is in Matthew, where Matthew says, right, Are not two sparrows sold in the marketplace for a penny? And yet not one of them falls to the ground without your Father noticing. Every hair on your head has been counted. Do you not imagine that you are worth more than two sparrows? The other passage, right, that I like so much is that when you were in the womb, I knew you. For me, those two passages imply that the God that I worship is a deeply personal God. He is not a God who loves humanity. He's not a God who loves human beings. He's a God who loves Chris Duncan. Hard as that is a lot of the time, ask my wife. But he loves me as a person. And when we think about this, right, if you go to Thomas Aquinas, Aquinas tells us that the good of one created being is worth more than all of created nature put together. Because we have a supernatural destiny that the world itself does not share. So that love of the human person in all their variety, in all of their idiosyncraticness, and all of their sinfulness, and all of their glory and goodness, for me leads us to think about a politics that attempts to account for that every time we make a decision. So I don't know if that answered your question, but that's the end of the book. The beginning of the book is a whole lot of stuff about Augustine and Rome and persecutions and eventual growth, of course, through things like the Reformation, right, and contemporary movements. So again, that's a really long story, but that's the end of the story that I try and write.
Older people remember the days when news came from people like Walter Cronkite and it was considered a public service. Today it's very different than that. So just some thoughts.
Sure.
I think it applies to both sides. I think you can get stuck in either information silo. But maybe your thoughts on that.
So, I think you laid it out incredibly well. I'm not sure I have a whole lot to say that adds to that, except to say that you're right. Now, we all know, right, on some level, if you've ever bought anything off of Amazon, right, if you're like me, you make a few purchases, books, or I still buy vinyl record albums, right? The next time I go on, they have all of these great suggestions for me. And the truth is, I want all of them. They get it right. Unless my daughter or son has been using my account, in which case it has nothing to do with me. But to your point, just to give you an example, and just to say again, I think that you captured it very well. One of my students was interning and working for the Steve Schmidt campaign in Missouri, right? So a newly elected senator from Missouri. And he was explaining to me their media strategy. And he said it's very particular. So in Kansas City and St. Louis, which tend to be fairly democratic and fairly liberal, we would get one version of the ad on television. And then in the middle of the state and in the more rural parts of the states, they would get another version of the commercial that had a lot of similarities, but were cut in ways that were designed particularly to appeal to those audiences. So even in terms of trying to figure out as much as you can from the media presence of particular candidates, you're not even seeing the same ads on television. And it's not that you're not seeing them at the national level, you're not seeing them locally. So if you were in Springfield, right, Missouri, instead of St. Louis, you saw a very different ad, right? So that's the kind of targeting that's taking place. And again, you're right. They have it down to a science, right? And in the long run, right, there's no way for it to, I think, help us be less divided with one another, because just like when we watch CNN or MSNBC or Fox or right? Other sorts of media that have very particular agendas, right? We're not hearing the same things, right? Not just the opinion people, but literally the news that's being covered isn't the same. So of course we're going to see the world very differently if that's where we're getting our information from. Just to finish the last point, because the nice thing about, of course, the printing press and libraries is that Adam Smith's book, The Wealth of Nations, is right next to Karl Marx's book, Das Kapital. So actually, when I go to the library to try and figure out economics, I have both available for me to choose from, but I can only watch one television station at a time.
I would like to know if it's a general thing that presidents take files. Does it happen all the time?
So I have never heard of it happening before this became an issue this year.
Yeah.
So I can't answer the question of whether it's happened before. I can say it's never been an issue that I've heard of. What I can say is that there have been a large number of public servants who have been tried and convicted of taking confidential documents out of spaces where they belong and taking them home. And those people, in many cases, have paid fines, and some of them have gone to jail. Some of them have taken thousands of documents, and it was intentional. And others have taken a few documents, and it was unintentional. Right? As you might imagine, right, you're in a room, you're reading a bunch of documents, you pack up your briefcase, you take it home, and you end up with it. That's inadvertent, right? It could happen to anybody. It shouldn't, but it could. In other cases, people have stolen documents and attempted to sell them to our enemies, have attempted, right, to profit from them. So there are lots of those cases. But in terms of a president having done this, this is the first time I've heard anybody talk about it was this year.
Well,
So I just don't know the answer.
He was vice president.
Right. It's the first time I've heard of a president in this situation. I've heard of lots of other people that have been in trouble for this. Yeah. But I don't know is my answer. Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much, Chris. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Father Gene Contadino here in the front of the room, thank you for arranging to have Dr. Duncan with us this evening. Friends, at the beginning of our evening, Kelly made reference to the surveys that are on your table. Please take a few minutes to complete that information. We would very, very much like to have input from all of you as to what you would like to see featured in these quarterly conversations. The other thing that we have been talking about in our planning team is that we would like to make arrangements if you are interested in helping to keep the conversation going in between these quarterly sessions. So by show of hands, would you like to see an opportunity here in this room in St. Leonard's to meet periodically to keep that conversation going so that we have an idea of the interest? Okay, thank you. Just put this on your calendar. If you are in fact interested, two things. Check that box on the survey form so that we know that, and then St. Leonard has graciously offered to have this room available for discussions. These are just sit around the table, have discussions with one another to keep the conversation going on the fourth Monday following each workshop, 4 to 6 p.m. here in this room. It's not a formal program, but it's just an informal opportunity to have the conversation. Thank you, Dr. Duncan, and have a safe ride home.